Canada is known as a land of trees, water, the oil sands, and another major export, marijuana. Pot growing is an export estimated at $20 billion a year. It's virtually recession-proof, and it's a major industry. And now the two markets, Colorado and Washington, are drying, or should I say burning up. Where does that leave this lucrative, albeit mostly illegal, industry? Here's Ian Mulgrew. He is columnist of the Vancouver Sun and the author of Bud Inc. Inside Canada's Marijuana Industry. Now, Ian, admittedly, this is an underground illegal industry, so it's probably hard to put a real total on it. We've said 20 billion. Does that sound close?
That's certainly in the ballpark from what the economists and the police are estimating.
How much of that comes from British Columbia, where you are?
Probably about a third of it. Our market here, if you were talking wholesale, is probably about $2 billion. If you're talking retail, it can maybe get up into the $5 and $6 billion range. So we're about a third of the country's market.
Okay, you got to explain this to me, because wholesale versus retail, I didn't know you could go to your corner store and buy this retail. So what do you mean?
Well, it's really just depending how you want to figure it out. For instance, if you're the RCMP, you have a tendency to figure everything out on the cost of a joint. Whereas if you're an economist, you tend to say the province produces, so many thousands of pounds, and they apply a figure like $2,400 a pound to it, rather than $2 or $3 a joint. So you get different figures.
Besides BC, what are the other major areas of production in the country?
Well, primarily Ontario and Quebec, where you would expect. We saw for a while there, about 5 or 6 years ago, an expansion of growing in the Maritimes. But it's still, a product that you want to keep pretty close to your market, because your risk factors and your risk costs go up the further away from market that you are.
And where do they grow it in Ontario?
The same place they do here, in basements, in unused bedrooms. They grow it outdoors. They grow it in barns. I think one of the biggest seizures in the country was in the former Molson's Brewery in Barrie, Ontario, where tens of thousands of plants were seized, and an incredibly sophisticated operation had been functioning for a handful of years.
I remember those stories well. Now tell me this though, Ian, is most of the growing that goes on, is it those huge grow-ops that take place very secretly in massive areas, or is it more likely, somebody who's got a few plants on the balcony?
Nobody has a few plants on the balcony anymore, by and large. It's all indoors where you can control all of the factors and you're assured of the production. And by and large, most of the organized crime grows are fairly substantial and large. And there are still a lot of mom and pop grows, people who are growing 15 or 20 plants in their basement. And certainly there's an awful lot of, in this province we have hundreds, in fact thousands of medical marijuana grow operations that can be quite substantial too.
Now, if this is a $20 billion annual industry, if you were to compare it to so-called legitimate industries, where would that rank?
That's probably about the size of Canada's mining industry. And as I said, and that's sort of the high end. I think at the low end, they think it's about as large as the Canadian cattle industry.
And not taxed, of course.
At the moment, no, in fact, and that's what's driving change in America as every government in the Western world, in fact, every government everywhere confronts the problem of declining revenues. It's how do you replace it? And also how do you battle organized crime? And legalizing marijuana promises at least a large tax boom and also a reduction on the spending side, because you're not going to spend as much on law enforcement.
Let's also consider how many people make their living off pot. What would you put that number at?
Well, in BC, for instance, the police were estimating well over 25,000 grow-ops. And so when you start to think about those kinds of numbers, and generally there's at least one or two people involved, you're looking at, in this province, of over 100,000 people. So across the country, you're probably looking at 500,000 people perhaps involved in the marijuana industry in Canada right now. And all of them, when you think of, aren't paying tax on those earnings. It's a sizable amount of money.
If pot were legalized or decriminalized, what would happen to all those people in that underground economy?
Well, most of them, we can presume, would continue to, move into the above-board economy, that the jobs that they're currently doing right now in the black market would be created in a legal market, that you would see companies being formed to grow marijuana, you would see stores being opened to sell marijuana, and I think you would see the emergence of an industry very similar to what we see in wines, where you have, small producers and large producers. You have an incredible variety of retail outlets across the country, and you have a pretty thriving industry that's multifaceted.
Well, let's just try to make a comparison here if we can, and admittedly this is imperfect, but if you were to create, in Ontario we sell spirits and wine at the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, the LCBO. If you were to set up a pot control board of Ontario and franchise it out and tax it, any guess about what annual revenues to the Ontario Treasury could be?
Well, let me say to you, I was just down in Washington State for the election, where they also had on the ballot the initiative to legalize marijuana. And in Washington State, which is a state not unlike British Columbia, they're expecting to raise $500 million through taxes. So that just gives you an idea. You're really talking about well over $1 billion in revenue across Canada if Canada was to legalize marijuana.
You've been affiliated with this drug since you were 14, I think you say in the book. Explain that, if you would.
Well, I think I was saying in the book that I had bought my first joint at 14. And of course, nowadays, one of the reasons, again, that people are pushing for the legalization is that marijuana is now more available to our teenagers and our kids than alcohol or tobacco. And that if we move to a new regulatory system and a legal system, that we'll be able to curb that in the same way we've curbed tobacco use among the young. So for me, this is a problem that I've certainly watched firsthand for almost 40 years now. And I think that the way we've been trying to control marijuana has been misguided. It hasn't worked, and it's time for a change in our public policy. I think that it would be better for our children, it's safer for our communities. I mean, the danger in our communities from having these grow-ops is just unbelievable. There's not only the problem with organized crime and the violence that surrounds them, there is the fire hazard that they pose, there are problems with mold. It's just bad from every way you look at it. And in this province, I'm sure you're aware, Steve, we've got 4 previous attorney generals. We've got all of the still living ex-mayors of Vancouver, all calling for legalization and a change in our drug policies.
All right, if Washington State and Colorado actually go through with what they say they want to go through with and realize the kind of revenues that they hope to realize, what do you think the impact will be on the Canadian pot situation?
Well, I think we're looking at it, and you will have to pardon the pun, it's a bit of a domino situation. I mean, already we've seen a handful of states say that they're going to conduct similar votes in the next round of elections. So we're going to see more states head down this path. And so more and more states are going to try this on. And the federal government in America has not been saber-rattling or trying to dissuade them. In fact, today we've just seen the Senate House Judiciary Committee say that it's going to conduct hearings in the new year into changing the marijuana laws. So I think that Canada, as it watches this happen south of the border, is probably going to find itself being pushed along the liberal and legalization road.
Can I assume, though, Ian, that you believe, as a part of that legalization or liberalization road, that this is still a product that you don't want in the hands of minors?
Absolutely.
So you're talking, when you talk about liberalizing it, you're talking about people who've only achieved the age of majority.
Absolutely, and I think it's important to recognize that no one here who is pushing for legalization in America, well, some of them are, but the vast majority of people who were behind the push for legalization in Washington State and in Colorado were not supporters of smoking marijuana. In fact, you know, Steve, I was at the election party, Victory Party, in Seattle. And there was about 25 of the people who had raised the money, who had fought the campaign, and who had won. And they had created this landmark victory of legal marijuana, which is now, you can now have it in Washington State. And there wasn't a single joint in the room. They were all having a glass of whiskey or a glass of cognac, but marijuana is not their drug of choice. And I think that's important to realize, that an awful lot of people are behind legalization and wanting better drug policies because they will improve our communities, they will make our children safer and provide for better drug education. And we can probably drive down the usage rates on these substances and create a more drug-free society.
For you, what makes more sense, decriminalizing or legalizing?
Oh, legalization, there's no question about it. Decriminalization, quite frankly, Steve, is a house of pain. What it does is allow consumers to sit at home and have their pot and eat their cheesies. Meanwhile, society still has to deal with the problems of organized crime and the black market of supply. It's not a good model. It's what happens in Amsterdam, where they still have real issues with the organized crime in Holland. And in the Low Countries. Legalization is the way to go. We need to regulate both the production, the sale, and the consumption of marijuana in the same way we do with alcohol or tobacco.
And just in our last 20 seconds here, Ian, you know, there's still lots of people in this country who think of pot in the way they think of reefer madness or the demon weed. Is Canada ready for legalization?
Some parts of the country aren't, as you're pointing out. Some parts of the country are going to need to be educated in this. British Columbia is ready. We've had a lot of public discussion for a number of years now, and I think that that's very important to emphasize. There's going to be no overnight change in laws here. It's going to take time to develop the proper model and regulatory regime for marijuana, and it is going to take time for people to be educated and to get up to speed on what the real risks are and what kind of issues that we're dealing with here.
That's Ian Mulgrew, the author of Bud Inc., Inside Canada's Marijuana Industry. Ian, good of you to join us on the line from the left coast.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.